Well, hello everybody. We are back. Apologize for the slight delay there. We didn't let a lot of wriggle room between the breakout sessions and our 2 o'clock. So I am really delighted to have with us here today Lindy Banky, who is the head of clinical development for Rebiotics, and also Kelly Brady, who is the VP of clinical operations for Series Therapeutics. And they are here with us today to talk about the impact that COVID-19 has been having on clinical trials related to C. diff. I'm sure if you're paying attention to the news, you have seen that many of our hospitals, especially our clinical, our academic medical centers that treat the most difficult to treat illnesses are kind of overwhelmed by COVID-19. And those same centers tend to be the places that we do clinical trials. So we're really happy to have you both with us to give us an update on how this may be affecting the development of treatments for C. diff, because we can't take our eye off that ball while we're working on something else. So we're probably gonna all drop off our cameras and let you guys focus on this slide. And I'm gonna turn it over to Lindy to take it away or Kelly to take it away. Either way, one of them is gonna take it away in a second.
Hi, everybody. This is Lindy Banky. Thank you so much, Christian, for inviting us to be here today to talk to everybody about our clinical trials and really the impact that we are observing because of the COVID-19 pandemic. Kelly and I have put together a number of different topics that just in general, I think, sort of underline the different challenges that sponsors are encountering while trying to continue clinical research in this current landscape. The first topic that we wanted to start with is just kind of the guidance that's being put out by both FDA and by IRBs regarding how to continue forward. And the new guidance from FDA really kind of acknowledges the changes that are being required, whether it's to protocols, patient visits, et cetera, that sponsors really need to consider in order to protect the health and well-being of study participants, first and foremost, but also to just acknowledge that there are challenges that are going to be arising due to quarantines. Some of the sites are even closing. Of course, there are going to be travel limitations for subjects getting to sites, and also for sponsors who have clinical research associates and monitoring teams that are overseeing the conduct of clinical trials at the study sites. Those travel limitations also have a big impact. And there's also disruptions to supply chain for those investigational products to actually get to the sites for administration to the participating subjects. It also acknowledges that both potential and active trial participants may become infected with COVID-19, that site personnel may become infected, and that there's maybe even an underlying fear that has to be acknowledged about entering study sites during this time. And with that said, there's still a need to bring these products to market. There's still infections going on. The fact that there's a COVID-19 viral epidemic does not mean that infections, including C. diff and other illnesses, don't continue to have an impact on patients' lives. And so as sponsors, we really are wanting to acknowledge the situation at hand that evolves on a continual basis. Literally day by day, we're monitoring what the impact of the current situation is. But we're also really committed to keeping the clinical trials moving to bring these products closer to FDA approval, and also to essentially provide in real time access to investigational products for these patients. So I think that the guidances being put forth are certainly out of necessity for sponsors to have some underlying framework to follow in order to continue conducting these trials in a way that's robust, but also safe and keeps that sort of paramount in clinical trial conduct, but also ensuring that we're still in compliance and are still doing things in a way that maintains the integrity of the trials. Kelly, do you want to speak to anything specifically about the guidances that are out there?
Yeah, Lindy, thank you so much for that great introduction. And hi, everyone. Happy to be here. So hard act to follow. Lindy gave a great summary. I think what I would add to that is that these guidances have been very helpful, I think, from both FDA and from WERB Copernicus. So WERB is one of the largest IRBs, of course, in North America. And they were one of the earliest to also go out and put some guidance out back in March around the flexibility that sponsors might need to implement in these trials for, number one, as Lindy mentioned, safety, but number two, also how to minimize the risks to the trial integrity. So I think as sponsors and of course our dedicated clinical site staff, we've all, of course, we believe in these trials. Patients have dedicated their time and their families have dedicated, their commitment to these trials. And we also feel that we have a commitment to see them through and to continue capturing the data to hopefully bring these trials to completion and hopefully to market for these types of patients. So I think while, of course, safety is our number one, finding ways to continue to capture that data and meet the endpoints for the trial is also really important. So I think when we saw the FDA guidance come out and the WERB guidance come out, their feedback on introducing flexibility, as long as it was clearly documented and as long as it was communicated to IRBs or potentially the FDA, we thought that was excellent, actually, because there's areas, as Lindy mentioned, where we can introduce some maybe deviations from current protocol to support the safety but continued treatment of patients. So whether that's extending visit windows, but documenting the rationale of why, whether that's using remote approach, which we can talk about further today, whether it's finding ways to continue sample selection also remotely, whether that's shipment or drive-by, there's a number of things that we'll talk about, but I think it was as long as we clearly document where we're deviating, the rationale of why we're deviating, and as long as we have a communication strategy, whether that's via a memo, a letter, a documentation to our IRBs, or a protocol amendment for that matter, but not immediately needed, that these are ways that we can continue to have patients stay on study, continue to receive treatment, and continue to gather this important data. So I think overall, the guidances that have been released have been very supportive of continued conducting trials, but acknowledging the challenges of this space with the COVID pandemic. So Lindy, anything else you think we should touch upon in terms of those guidances?
No, I think that was probably pretty comprehensive, and I think it is good to find that balance, in the current state of so many unknowns with regard to when do we go back to quote unquote normal. It is really, I think, imperative that we're able to lean on what general guidance is out there, but also have that flexibility to understand that what will happen at the sites is likely going to vary. And obviously in a clinical trial, we want to keep things as consistent as possible. We want to really control for as many variables as we possibly can so that the data is interpretable at the end of the day. But it does require right now that we understand and obviously with FDA issuing guidance that echoes that there is a need for flexibility, and the IRBs are more than willing to review things in a very expedited manner to help us identify those solutions and then push those solutions forward into execution mode really quickly. So I think that just kind of provides the framework for the topics that we wanted to cover today.
Definitely. Thanks, Lindy. And I think it's actually a great segue to the next bullet on our slide, which was communication to sites, because, and I know that Lindy and I feel similarly on this topic, but it's really only from our experts on site, the ones who are treating patients day in and day out, who are truly on the ground and understanding the challenges in clinical trials in light of the pandemic. So understanding which flexibility we need for the trials right now is really being driven by our communication to sites. So when this first started, I think most sponsors, what we're doing is working very closely with our CRO partners and via our CRO partners and our CRAs to understand the individual challenges of our sites and our patient population. So understanding the fear of patients, wanting to come to the clinic perhaps, or delaying visits, hearing from them whether samples are specifically a challenge, understanding whether site staff has been reduced. So I think it's these communications that have allowed us to implement the best actions to help our trials continue. And so I think some of that communication involves we've done some site surveys. We've had some webinars where folks can come from our sites and ask questions. And we've also implemented some site guidance documents. So Lindy, happy to hear from you on some of your experience on communication strategies.
Yes, thank you, Kelly. And I agree wholeheartedly with you that the flexibility and transparency right now is really critical with our sites. Partly because there is that need to kind of handle things on a case-by-case basis in some ways, because each of the sites are going through a different situation depending on the availability of their investigators. Of course, some of them are even being pulled away to either care for patients or to participate in priority trials that involve COVID-19. We've also, similar to your experience, Kelly, we've got some sites who are reducing staff, and that of course has an impact on our ability to reach the right people at the site, even just to have the communication about what's happening there and how we can be of support. But it certainly, it has an impact on the patient care too, because the study staff that the subjects are accustomed to reaching out to having contact with, to having visits with, if those are required to be in-office visits, that those things may be changing. And so it really has been an effort. We Rebiotics employs our own clinical research associates or CRA team. And so our field-based team, of course, is not traveling right now, but we've been able to employ them to sort of be that support system too, while they're home-based, to reach out to our study sites, to offer assistance where needed, to help troubleshoot when there are specific items coming up, whether with subjects or compliance to the protocol procedures, and helping them navigate those things, with their IRBs if we need to implement new tools or changes to the way that the protocol is being executed, or just to even get a status update. Some of our sites are truly just not enrolling right now, and that's again due to a variety of reasons. I think I had heard at one time that patient enrollment in trials in the U.S. was down by almost 70% in the last month compared to March of a year ago. So that in general, it speaks to the slowdown of trial enrollment. But again, because as sponsors working on investigational products that are really critical to bring to approval and provide for as broad availability as possibly can be attained, we want to support the sites who are really doing the heavy lifting in being able to figure out what makes sense for them right now, even if that means that they can't bring subjects in, what does that entail, and how do we get going again? How do we make sure that we're following the subjects who are already enrolled? And in whatever way we can lend support, we're trying to do that.
Yeah, Lindy, totally agree. And I think one thing that we have thought about is how to stay 2 steps ahead. And what I mean by that is, I think just as your CRAs are doing, utilizing our CRAs to work with sites to understand, okay, what's the next visit in the protocol? What's the visit after that? And do we have a plan to address what we need for that visit, right? So whether it's shipping something or shipping IP, a drive-by visit, a remote visit, a phone call, at least what's the minimum that we can do to support the site in preparing for that next visit, so that it's not too late by the time, it's not the day before the visit. So planning ahead for any of those important visits and ensuring patients have what they need for those visits, I think is a lot of where the effort is spent right now, but it is possible with our study teams. So I think that's an important activity as well. Yep.
Yes. Agreed. I think we can maybe transition from there to our next topic, which is sort of weaved into everything that we're talking about, honestly, and that's execution of the protocol and compliance to the protocol. And we've already touched on a number of ways that protocol execution is really being impacted. And I think the onus is on the sponsors to really do a comprehensive review of the protocols that we are executing to evaluate and prioritize what really needs to be done in person versus what can be done virtually. And I honestly think that some of the exercise that sponsors are going through now to evaluate things because of COVID-19 will end up impacting the way that we do trials even going forward. I don't know that we'll ever return to normal, so to speak, but maybe finding what an improved normal or a new normal might be for trial execution could be incorporating some of these things prospectively and proactively into the protocols, so that we can make compliance to the protocol easier, that we can ease the burden on subjects or caregivers, and really make it a more streamlined approach to participating in clinical trials. I think that might actually be if there is a silver lining to some of these things, I think that might be one of them. And I think not only looking at what can be done remotely versus in person, but really prioritizing what assessments need to be done and the timing of those assessments. If there are windows that can be extended or other accommodations made without impacting the integrity of the trial. And again, it's sort of threading that needle a bit. But really, I do think that there are opportunities as sponsors to look at our programs really critically and make those changes so that the sites really don't have to come to a screeching halt, that subjects do continue to have access. And that I think is really important about the way that FDA has approached this. That some of the research bodies, including the IRBs, have acknowledged the challenges that we and study sites are experiencing. And then the other piece that I'll speak to before throwing it back to you, Kelly, is just underscoring the importance of documentation. I think the inevitability is that there will be some, protocol deviations or things happening that perhaps wouldn't have happened if we weren't in the situation that we're in right now with regard to executing those protocols. And so we want to, lend our support where we can to the sites to be sure that they are documenting things appropriately, making sure that those things are very clear about what the deviation to the protocol was, or what things were handled in a different way, or how they were handled, so that it's clear and again, in keeping with protecting the integrity of the data collected. that we can ensure that that's still sound and compliant at the sites to the extent possible.
Yeah, thanks, Lindy. I think I'll maybe pick up two of the themes that you just summarized. And the first is, well, one of them was definitely that documentation. So I think supporting sites with understanding how to document actually gives us a better chance of executing within those parameters. And what I mean by that is, even when it's a protocol deviation, giving sites guidance on how to document and making sure that at the end of the day, in 2 months or 3 months, or, however long some of these challenges last, we're able to summarize what steps we took and which procedures were deviated from with a COVID tag, for example, because at the end of the day, it will become really important for us in our clinical study reports and in talking with the regulators that we summarize, what we did during this time, and to show that we still had data integrity. And then the same thing in terms of the sites actually entering the data, if they are, delaying visits, or if they are capturing, for example, informed consent over the phone or virtually, or if they are conducting questionnaires virtually or over the phone, supporting sites with the data entry and documentation instructions to do that. And I think when you provide those instructions and provide that guidance, there's a better chance that sites will agree to use those flexible options. So I think that's definitely important. In terms of some of the other things that Lindy mentioned, I couldn't concur more that this is, I think the work that we're doing now will impact clinical trials for a long time. And what I mean by that is reducing the burden on patients is something that we've always tried to do, but this is bringing it to the forefront. And so whether that's working with vendor partners to see if we can ship investigational product directly to patients or reduce that turnaround time, whether it's telehealth visits or remote nursing services, right? I think that there are some services that are available to sites and to sponsors now that will only become more popular. And sometimes there's challenges to set these things up, but I think it's an opportunity for us to learn how to better support patients in some of these remote ways. And so these are just some of the things that I think will change moving forward.
Agreed. Wholeheartedly agree. Let's see, I think next we have sponsor oversight and remote monitoring. Do you want to kick that one off, Kelly?
Yeah, that sounds great. So far we've been talking primarily about the flexibility for our patients and for the sites and the difficulties with staffing or visits. But of course, as sponsors, our oversight in monitoring is one of our most important activities and responsibilities. And so what we've learned, especially starting probably in even late February, early March, is that a number of our sites, whether those are larger hospitals or private academic centers, were either delaying or canceling on-site visits from our CRAs. And so as sponsors, most of us have now taken the steps to implement remote opportunities for monitoring. And this is a good thing. Remote monitoring, of course, has been around a while, as has but it's easier said than done. And I think the principles that we're trying to implement here with remote monitoring is, number one, to ensure continued safety for our subjects and to support the sites, right? To ensure that they know that we're still there for them, that we're still supporting them with data entry and still offering them help if they have questions on either patient eligibility, patient safety, vendor questions, that we're still there for them as CRAs, CRO, and sponsor. I think an important part of implementing remote monitoring is, number one, understanding what sites can accommodate. So part of when we started to think about remote monitoring, it was reaching out to sites and understanding, do you have the ability to to transfer data online, right? Whether that was fax, scan, over Zoom, over WebEx. And so understanding what the sites can do was critical for us. And then there's a number of things that we can talk about here, but probably the second is informed consent and our monitoring plans. And so if your site has already had, or your study has already had remote monitoring, your informed consent for your subjects may have already said that your information may be shared electronically. But if not, that was something that sponsors have had to implement quickly with IRBs to get that information in the consents so that remote monitoring could proceed. And then I think acknowledging, just as we did, that there's going to be deviations that occur during this period, is updating the monitoring plans as sponsor to say we may not be able to comply with all of our previous schedules or all of our previous SDV goals, but that during this period we'll be implementing these types of remote activities and just really doing our best with that documentation. So there's a lot we can talk about. I'll turn it back over to you, Lindy.
Yeah, that was really well stated, Kelly. It definitely mirrors a lot of the activity that Rebiotics is doing as well. As far as the first kind of step was just to look at what our own capabilities were with regard to the staff, their training on remote monitoring, making sure that once we took this step, that we were doing it in a way that was really in line with what the true meaning, definition, and just kind of the approach to remote monitoring is. And in some cases, bringing our processes and procedures and tools up to the place where they needed to be for us to begin on our end. And then similar to what you were saying too is, helping the sites along, because all of them, I think, have, again, unique situations within their own institutions. Some have been able to readily provide us with the ability to do remote SDV. Others don't even know where to begin, or are not able to because of their institutions' practices or procedures that are in place on their end. And so we've really had to, again, take kind of a case-by-case basis approach with some of our sites to assess what they can and cannot do. And hand-holding where necessary to help them to understand what it is that we need, make sure that the terminology that we're using is understandable. And then again, that documentation piece, I think, is a really critical part of making sure that we're doing things in a compliant way that's easily traceable, to identify retrospectively what did we do and how did we do it. But truthfully, I think I find myself grateful for the technology providing a platform to even do this. This couldn't have been done when I started my work in clinical trials. I can't imagine having had a similar situation and being able to implement some of the remediations that we've been able to do relatively quickly. Although, not easy, I definitely think that there is a large amount of things that are already in place from a technology standpoint, and tools and cloud-based things that make these possible, first and foremost. And also, I think that the smaller size of our company, at least, just speaking from our experience, we're a wholly owned subsidiary of a parent company, but our Rebiotics is a relatively small team of people. And so it almost makes it easier to get over the barriers that are in place when it comes to adopting new practices and incorporating new technology and new processes and procedures, because we don't necessarily have the legacy systems that would need to be overcome. So I do think that we've got some benefits there, where in larger industry sponsors, there's probably more people and deeper pockets to help get some of these things advancing, but it can be harder to overcome some of those things that are already in place and kind of understood to be the process and procedure for certain things. So knowing that we have to be really flexible and really adaptable, we've been fortunate to be able to kind of flex with the needs of our sites and the needs to implement this remote monitoring pretty quickly.
Yeah, Lindy, I agree with you about the small company ability to hopefully be responsive quickly. And I think the training aspect and the relationship aspect of that Series has with sites, I'm sure is very similar to that of Rebiotics, where I think making sure that our site staff does feel comfortable is a huge part of their adoption of some of this remote, maybe what they might consider scary. I'm like you, I was a CRA and I used to monitor paper. So every now and then I'm still a little bit, I guess you could say, intimidated by all the electronic systems and EMR. But I think when you proactively communicate with sites for upcoming visits, if you are even sending them letters to say, this is what I would like to review over the phone with you in 2 days or over Zoom, if you can prepare it, and kind of giving those requests ahead of time, making sure they feel comfortable, that has definitely helped us see some adoption of some of these remote approaches. But it's definitely a challenge, definitely a living process. And, there are still some sites who unfortunately are still struggling with doing some of this. So that remains, an effort, I think, by sponsors across all different types of trials, including those for patients with C. diff.
Yeah, I agree. And our last topic, as far as response at study sites, I think we've done a pretty darn good job of incorporating all of these issues sort of in the interwoven fashion that they really do present themselves. But I would just make a couple of additional points on the response at study sites, in addition to what we've already said. I think we as the sponsor kind of have to acknowledge that the sites are going through a lot of difficulties and challenges themselves, whether it's the reduced staff or their staff being pulled away to prioritize the COVID-19 activities or studies. There's also the fact that a lot of them are maybe in some ways trying to troubleshoot and implement their own solutions. And I think that's something that we are cognizant of and trying to get, like you said, Kelly, maybe 2 steps ahead of that before it happens. Because although, it's noble for them to come up with the efforts to overcome the challenges that they are seeing when it comes to protocol execution, I think that some of those solutions may not be in the best interest of the trial itself, what the intention of the study is. And so although it perhaps comes from a really good place, it's necessary for us as the sponsor to really assess how to help them get through those challenges before they're in a position where they're actually trying to weave their way through them. And again, it kind of goes back to that communication component where, maybe they were opting to contact patients or subjects via email or text messages. And so we need to kind of preemptively imagine that those are the directions that they're going and help them identify solutions that will be more of a long-term solution than a short-term solution. Ensure that privacy and data security issues are not being compromised, and that we can preserve the documentation for the integrity of the trial. Again, I just think the general statement about site engagement is more critical now than ever. It has always been important, of course, to ensure that we've got that touch point with the sites, ensuring that we're engaged in a way that allows us to be at the site's beck and call to some extent. But I just think with the COVID-19 pandemic and the way that we are trying to be adaptable and flexible, it just highlights that we have to be even more open with our sites about what we're doing and why we're doing it and how we expect them to respond. And so I think doing that just allows the focus to remain on the patients, the focus to remain on, access to potential, treatment product, and highlighting, the real need to bring these trials to fruition.
That was a great conclusion, Lindy. And I think I fully concur with everything you've said there. I would say that right now, in terms of support, it's more important than ever that our PIs and our patients know that we're still there for them during this challenge, that we're not giving up on, finishing these trials and continuing to either enroll or move our research forward, and that some of the steps that we're taking to get through this pandemic hopefully will allow us to extend treatment to maybe even a larger population in the future, whether that's more remote areas, patients that aren't comfortable traveling as much, and in thinking just about better ways to execute at clinical sites. So if anything, maybe there is a silver lining that we can find in this very challenging, scary time, knowing that patients still need important treatments and we want to still be there for them, and sincerely are dedicated to our research. So just stressing that relationship with our sites, supporting PIs and continuing to have treatment options for their subjects is really driving us day to day. So appreciate the opportunity to talk about this with this group. And thanks very much, Lindy. It was great going back and forth with you.
Yes, likewise, Kelly.
Well, thank you guys so much. If you want to pop back onto camera, I just posted in the, if we get any questions. We did have one earlier that you may or may not have addressed, I think, depending on your perspective, but one of our scientific advisory board and board members, Gerard, asked, many clinical trials are difficult for patients to access due to living in underserved areas. Is there an opportunity for innovations required under the pandemic to actually improve access for patients interested in clinical trials? So, once we get back to whatever the new normal is, I think the question is, are what you're doing now to continue the trials maybe opening up a new way of thinking about this longer term?
Yeah,
I think both Kelly and I say yes.
I think we're both very supportive of that. That's what Lindy and I are always thinking about. How do we extend, to more patients and reach more patients? So I think some of these either remote options, remote nursing to me is a really big one that can be challenging to set up, but I do think it's a viable option moving forward, where if a patient doesn't have access to transportation or lives further away, you can get these delegated nurses who are trained on your protocol, who may be able to travel to an easier site for a patient, or even to that patient's home and help them with some of those things. Same thing with, direct IP shipment to a patient's home could potentially help get some of those underserved populations more access. So thoughts on that, Lindy?
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think, we're learning too in the course of troubleshooting and identifying solutions that we just honestly didn't have to think of before. I think it forces us to identify some of these alternatives to the way that, things have traditionally been done. And not only does it, kind of expand perhaps the population that we might be able to reach, but also just to make, clinical trials a little bit more, what would I say, just a little bit more accessible in general, as far as even those that are perhaps within, driving distance or very close to a clinical research site. I think that the idea of participating in a trial can perhaps seem a little bit overwhelming for some, whether it's location or it's age or, it's a perception about what the requirements would be and what it might entail to participate in a trial, the easier that we can make some of these things for, again, either the subjects themselves or the caregivers who are assisting them in participating in the trial. Those are learnings that can be applied to any trial moving forward, not just the pandemic situation now, because I think even some of the remote options, like Kelly was saying, the remote nursing is, I think that's a tremendous tool for us to consider moving forward. But right now, with people in isolation, even that solution is difficult because subjects aren't wanting to invite somebody into their home, even to complete those assessments or help them to continue with the trial. So those kind of things remain unique to the pandemic, but there are things I think that we can broadly apply moving forward that will actually improve the way that we conduct research.
Yeah. And maybe one other thing just to mention is how we talk about safety. So we talked today about really how our priority getting through this pandemic is patient safety. But I think this is also bringing to light how we talk about the safety of our trials and how we talk about our therapies for patients. And, for folks who may not have a scientific background or may not understand what a trial is doing, it's our job to work on how we explain it, how we talk about safety, how we talk about the risks, how we talk about why this visit is important or this sample. And this is an opportunity in light of COVID when everyone's thinking about getting sick or staying home and their health, that moving forward, there's ways for us to maybe explain better the importance of certain things that we do on our trial. So that's something that I'll take away from this. And I think we're all PIs, coordinators, sponsors thinking about moving forward.
So I have another question from Kevin saying, how are sites adjusting relative to finding new patients that aren't accessing the healthcare system right now? Kelly, do you want to try that one, or Lindy?
Sure. I'm going to be very honest. I think it's a challenging time for clinical trials. I think there are some, as Lindy said, clinical trials are having a decrease in enrollment. I think that though in certain populations and certain conditions, when patients still get ill, they still need to contact their doctor or their ID doctor, their gastroenterologist. And so those patients still need care. So I think for patients who may be feeling okay, they may be delaying a visit. But for those that have a critical need and are more in an acute stage, then there still needs to be a mechanism or an avenue for them to get the right care and have that communication. And so I think that's what some of our site staff are dealing with right now, is finding a way to reduce non-essential, but of course still offer care. So not a perfect answer. It's a little bit of this and a little bit of that.
Yeah, I would agree with you, Kelly. I don't think I could have answered it better. It feels a little waffly to provide an answer to that because it's hard. I mean, it really is difficult no matter how many solutions we identify. I don't think that we can do it in a way that checks all of the boxes. I think that there are still challenges out there that we haven't figured out how best to handle them, seamlessly. And so, although we're putting our best foot forward, and we're trying to help the sites do the same thing with regard to patient care, especially, I still think that there are inevitable impacts that we can't mitigate 100%.
So what I think is going to be our last question, because our time is almost up. So I think this might be a pre-pandemic question, which is, what has been the most effective strategies and tactics that have increased patient enrollment in your clinical trials?
So I'll jump in. I think maybe two things. Education is, I think, a big one, is making sure that we're providing our site staff the tools to educate patients on what our trial is about, the therapy, the mechanism of action, and so that they feel empowered and they feel educated to share with the subject and have that communication. And then I would say, it sounds silly, but making the life of our sites easier, whether that's enrollment assistance, advertising support, reducing vendor complexity, they work so hard. So whatever we can do to kind of understand the barriers and reduce it, I think those have been effective methods for us, is kind of that individual attention for site challenges. Lindy?
Yeah, well said. And we do have a recruitment team that works specifically not only to ensure that we're kind of coming up with the best tools and things to, just as you said, Kelly, make it as easy as possible for the sites, but also to sort of have that engagement, because I think a customized approach is necessary at a lot of our sites. Just throwing at them an enrollment plan or a recruitment plan that includes maybe a website or a landing page or a referral program or Google or Facebook ads. All of those things I think are helpful, but it doesn't always make sense in a prepackaged way that's generic enough for us to just roll it out to every site. We really have to assess what makes sense for the particular patient population at a given site, or what makes sense for their capabilities around technology, or sometimes it depends on how savvy the coordinator is around some of these things, and that impacts what we propose as an enrollment and recruitment tool. And beyond that, I think it's not just getting subjects into the trial, it's retaining those subjects so that we can get the follow-up and the safety data. So retention is really important too, just as much as it is getting study drug to these patients. It's also making sure that we can get all of the data points that we need, so that ultimately we can bring the products to market and really improve accessibility for a broader population.
Well, I mean, I really thank you both for doing this. I know that you've been doing a yeoman's job to try to finish these trials, and we are obviously very committed to having there be new treatments for folks who are battling C. diff, particularly recurrent C. diff. And so we have our fingers absolutely crossed that you guys get over the finish line. And of course, we always bring awareness to the clinical trials to the extent that we can. So I do really appreciate you taking the time out of what is an odd time for us all to be trying to get our work done, to spend it with us. We're really grateful to Series and Read Biotechs for your ongoing support of our work and the whole C. diff community. So thanks again. And I look forward to meeting you both in person. So thanks again to Lindy and Kelly.